Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. We think this is really going to be an interesting and valuable presentation. We really appreciate you taking the time. You are here for the AIA Contract Documents BIM webinar series entitled Minimizing Risk when Including BIM in Your Construction Contracts, and this is part 2. We're going to be talking about sharing BIM on your project, and I'm going to go over a little bit recap of part 1 in a couple of minutes, but get some administrative things out of the way. First, any type of copyright disclaimers and information can be located on this slide. Disclaimer, pretty important, just saying we're not providing any legal advice today. If you do have questions about BIM as it relates to your project, the best thing you can do is consult an attorney who can give you appropriate legal counsel on the particular facts and circumstances that you're dealing with on your project. And let's do some introductions. So like I said, good afternoon, everybody. My name is James Germano. I'm an attorney with the AIA Contract Documents program located in Washington, D.C. I am a former construction litigator working in the private practice of law for about 7 years before coming over to the AIA a little over 3 years ago. I work with the Contract Documents Committee to update the AIA's suite of documents on a sort of an overlapping and revolving 10-year cycle. And we're pretty excited about some updates that we have coming your way with respect to BIM, Building Information Modeling, which is why we're hearing from our esteemed panel of experts today. So without further ado, I'm going to let each of these 3 gentlemen introduce themselves, but first I just sort of want to give you an overview. You're going to be hearing today from Peter Noon, Greg Sweeney, and Virgil Gay, who are all members of the AIA's Contract Documents Committee, and all of whom worked on the digital practice or the BIM documents that are going to be coming out later this year. Let's go around the virtual room, so to speak, and I want to allow each of you to give you an opportunity to introduce yourself. So, Mr. Peter Noon, let's start with you. Can you introduce yourself, please?
Oh, thanks, James. Yeah, my name is Pete Noon. I'm a principal with the firm Solomon Cordwell Benz. It says here that I'm in Mountain View, California, but that's not true. I'm in San Francisco. But I am the managing director of the office there, of our firm's office in San Francisco. But right now I'm actually working for both our Boston and Chicago offices as well. So been with SCB about 37 years and been on the documents committee now for, I'm in my 7th year.
Great, thank you, Peter. Greg, let's go to you.
Hello, everybody. I'm Greg. I'm with Rossetti. We're located out in Detroit. We're a sports and entertainment architecture firm. It's been around about 50 years. We tend to focus on sports global and Detroit local kind of projects. And I've been here roughly 25 years and counting. And we've been implementing Revit on our projects, BIM, since about 2006. And I think I started my session on the AIA doc communities right at COVID, so 2020. So it's been mostly remote, so fun. So thank you.
Yeah, Greg, I think we met in person very briefly once and then haven't met in person since, hopefully soon. And then last but certainly not least, Mr. Virgil Gay. Can you introduce yourself, Virgil? Tell us a little bit about who you are and what you do.
Okay, I'm sure you can hear me, Greg. Everyone?
Yeah.
Okay, great. All right, well, I'm Virgil Gay. I'm CEO of Virgil Gay & Associates. We've been in business doing managing the planning, design, and construction of projects for owners for about 12 years now. Prior to that, I served as Chief Facilities Officer for 3 of the larger university systems in Texas, and briefly served as Chief Architect for the City of Houston, and have a corporate background with AT&T for over 20 years right out of school. Glad to be here today, and this has been one of my favorite topics throughout my career.
Awesome. Well, thank you all 3 for introducing yourselves and for taking the time to have a little chat about BIM with us today. I'm going to stop sharing my screen, actually. And this isn't a traditional webinar where we put information up on slides and just sort of talk through it. It's going to be more of a conversation. And we would encourage audience participation and involvement. So if you have questions, throw them into the chat, send them over, and we'll try and get them answered in real time. What I want to do real quick is review part one and to sort of get you primed here for part two. So in part one, we had three panelists, experts like we do today, and we were talking about sort of introduction to sharing BIM models on projects and priming that topic with something that we refer to as the knowledge divide. And if you attended part one, you're familiar with that term, but if you didn't, what we mean when we talk about the knowledge divide is the difference in understanding, different understanding levels of BIM when you talk about the sort of the boots on the ground, the actual day-to-day, we refer to them shorthanded and colloquially as BIMers. So like your people who are in front of the computer doing the modeling and performing modeling on a day-to-day basis. That's on the one side of the divide. And then on the other side of the divide are your lawyers, your contract negotiators, your senior level risk managers, people who don't necessarily understand like the intricacies involved in modeling, but really understand the contract issues surrounding projects really well. And the way that this issue presents itself is there are contract issues that arise that maybe the negotiators might understand very well, but the doers, the BIMers, the modelers, they might not understand the contracting and legal implications so well. And the inverse is true. So you might have implications, a BIM specific issue, a modeling issue that comes up that the day-to-day modelers, they understand that really well and they can really get granular on that. But then that might go way over the head of an attorney such as myself who negotiates clauses but has no idea how a Revit model works, for example. And so in part one, we talked about, before you even start thinking about sharing models, you have to acknowledge and address this knowledge divide. Acknowledge and address the knowledge divide. And we gave some strategies on how to do that. Primarily your pre-negotiation internal meetings and getting the lawyers together in the same room as the modelers and saying, all right, how do we sort of teach each other about what we're doing? So the natural progression of that conversation would be, okay, now that we've sort of bridged the gap, or we've tried to, of this knowledge divide, we're going to start sharing models, and not only obviously within our firm, but with other project participants. And that's what we're going to talk about today, is how and when and whether and what types of different sharing occurs on projects. So with that framework in mind, I'm going to sort of go around the horn, and I'm going to ask each of you maybe some big ticket items, and then we're going to get a little bit more granular talking about sharing models. So Pete, I want to go to you first. And the concept of model sharing can sometimes be intimidating. And I know it means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. If you talk about model sharing with one construction firm, they might think of something completely different than if you talk about sharing models with a different architecture firm or maybe an owner or something like that. So in your experience, what's the spectrum of model sharing? Does it go from we're not sharing at all to like we're giving it to everyone for all purposes? What does that spectrum look like to you? I guess let's start there.
Well, thanks. Yeah, the spectrum is wide, and it goes, from the not sharing at all. When we've been using BIM at SCB now for a little over 20 years, and I think when we first started, we didn't really share a model. It was really used as its most basic level, which was to produce 2D drawings that we then issued to a contractor and an owner and so forth. And it can go all the way from there to taking a model and issuing it potentially as a contract document. And we've looked at all of those potential uses in the documents committee, as you know, and try to address them in our documents. But right now we've been we're sort of in the middle firmly in the middle. We share our model with all of our consultants and certainly with many of our owners and with the contractors on projects that we're working on. And you know, it's the use of that model is everything again from just basic coordination. We've certainly used it to develop metrics, to do analytics on buildings, whether it's energy use, lighting, shadows, and sun studies, so forth. We do a lot of parametric design, so that is something that tends to be more internal, but results in exporting information to contractors and owners. But I think where we are today, we've got 2 or 3 projects where we're actually working with the contractor to build a digital twin. And so where we're not issuing our model as a contract document, that which we are producing is an integral part of their federated model that they're taking to build a digital twin, which is really a virtual model of the building that they're resolving all of the various intricate details and juxtapositions in the architecture and the detailing, the joining of systems. They're detailing all of that virtually before they get out into the field. Hopefully that we're answering a lot of questions before they actually start digging for the foundations.
Sure, sure. You mentioned a couple things that I want to follow up with some questions about. So you said that sort of on the one hand, you have maybe more of a siloed approach where, let's say with the traditional design bid build. So you have your design team on the one side and your construction team on the other side. And each of those 2 teams has their own separate models. They do not share them between one another. And that's how the project goes. And you have your traditional 2D drawing set. That's what goes over the net to the other side, so to speak. So in that framework, let's say that's on one side of the spectrum. What are some of, I guess, the risks and benefits of a siloed approach to model sharing, which would be sort of no sharing?
Yeah, I think the biggest risk is not being able to take advantage of using the model for coordination. So we're back into the days when I started where we were overlaying Mylars on a light table, trying to figure out, you know, coordination between structure and various mechanical, plumbing, electrical issues and the architecture. You know, it can be done, and it's certainly been done for, you know, thousands of years. But the power of BIM is to be able to take and use the virtual environment to help visualize a lot of that coordination. So I think the biggest risk of the siloed approach is just not being able to use that and missing out on the opportunities.
That's a great point. You had mentioned, I guess maybe flipping to the entire other end of the spectrum for a second, you mentioned a digital twin, which you described as like a sort of a virtual replica of the project. And in between there, you mentioned a model as a contract document, which to me is one of like the third rails of building information modeling. So I want to hold off on that topic for right now, and I want to go to digital twins. So what's been your experience with digital twins from a risk perspective? If you coordinate, you're with a design firm, obviously. So from a design firm's perspective, I guess if you're coordinating with a construction firm in the creation of a digital twin, what kind of risks do you look at, and maybe how might you manage and mitigate those risks?
Yeah, I think when we turn over our model to a contractor, there's a couple of things that we want to try to have ironed out before we do that. First of all, it's the retention of intellectual property. There are some details and some content in our models that we want to retain ownership of, and some of those things are, you know, in our contracts potentially the owner has, or our client has ownership of that material. So we need to get that straight with everybody before we start sharing. The other I think, risk, and it's not really a risk, but it's just financial. If we're participating in this process, it requires a lot of upfront work on our part that needs to be recognized in our agreement with our clients and in our fee. And if that isn't recognized, then it's difficult to be able to do the things that we need to do to feed that information to a contractor who's producing the actual digital twin for the project.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. You mentioned, getting the owner's perspective, negotiating fees, understanding the scope of work involved, and I think that's a really important part of this discussion. And I want to ask Virgil about that eventually from the owner's perspective. But before we get there, I want to talk about what I think is sort of the elephant in the room, which is BIM as a contract document, and the risks and benefits associated with models being used as a capital C, capital D contract document. And if you're familiar with the AIA's family of documents, then you know that capital C, capital D contract document, which is, when we use that term, that's what we're talking about today. That's a defined term in the AIA's family of documents, and it has a very specific meaning, and it has very specific and important implications, that the use of that term and what is and is not considered a contract document. And up until recently, maybe the last 10 or 15 years, no one had really anticipated models being used as contract documents because they didn't exist yet. The technology hadn't come along. But now that models are becoming so ubiquitous and so common, that topic is out there, and they're starting to be used in a manner that is at least consistent with, if not identical to, being used as a contract document. So Greg, I want to turn to you and sort of ask you the $40,000 question, which is, what are the pros and cons of using a model as a contract document? And then if you could just maybe elaborate on your experience, if you have any, with the model being used that way, and maybe some of the risk mitigation techniques that you and your firm use if you are having a model being used as a contract document.
Thanks, Jimmy. I believe the thought of this makes most architects panicked, and certainly gives them great trepidation at the thought of it. It's not something that, as the AIA Doc Committee, when we started to take a look at this, I think we've come to the conclusion, as we're about to issue some documents, that this is not going away as the elephant in the room. It's something that's out there, and it's coming as a part of this industry, and portions of the industry are probably further ahead than others. But the idea that an owner and a contractor would want the model to be a contract document, and we came up with some terms, whether it was a model portion, maybe a part of the project, maybe a discipline, maybe specific elements might be issued as the contract, in lieu of maybe formal PDF documents at the end of the day for some of those elements. And then the idea of the model is always changing. So the idea that everybody needs to understand, if something is to be represented as a part of a contract document, it needs to be a specific model version, meaning it's a moment in time, date stamped, numbers of data bits that are included, and all of those elements, so that it's somehow stamped, so to speak, frozen for the purposes of a contract, and be able to be issued. So some of the risks at the end of the day are that most design teams are not thinking this way when they're developing their model. They view a model as a container of information that includes sheets and schedules and views and lots of placeholder details that you may or may not be putting on your project. So if you're about to issue some portion as a contract, you need to be real clear about what's in that model, and it's going to focus the team to make sure it's organized and cleaned up and identified as to what is the purpose and what exactly are we issuing. So there are risks for sure. The benefits certainly would be that we're all going to be leveraging on the same basic model of information that's been started by the design team. The consultants, the architects have been spending countless thousands of hours developing this project, And now you want to have a direct connection to the contractor and subcontractor so you don't lose information. You're able to build upon that model and continue with their scopes of work, the adding in the support mechanisms, the connections, and things of that nature for the MEP systems and structural systems. But then hopefully the benefits will become, depending on what you're agreeing to, you might be able to use it directly for layout. So instead of the architects teams exhaustively spending time dimensioning every nuance of walls and offsets and elements, you may be able to create portions of the model or specific views that can be utilized directly by the contractor into specific surveying or equipment that would be able to output that information directly for them so that there's not questions. It's like, here's what's in the model and it's able to be outputted. The one caveat we all need to understand is the design team is building an idealized version of the building. We're building a picture of an intent. And the contractors, again, columns and elements may be, fractionally different in the real world. Column locations, dimensions might be slightly different. So there's always going to be some interface between any of our design models that would get even enumerated as a contract document and the contractor's interface. But our hope is to minimize, the benefit would be to minimize that delta and that gap in time and that delta of information. To streamline it. Complex geometry that would be very complicated to potentially show the dozens of dimensions or hundreds of dimensions if you have a really complex shape or form to a building, can usually be presented in a model and shared very quickly. Our own experience with this has not really been as an office using it as a contract, I guess formally as a contract document, but we have issued portions or elements of projects where there are very complex geometries on the interiors of projects that might be GFRG formed or CNC machine cutouts of various elements that we didn't do elaborate drawings of, but we did a very detailed model and were able to share the model that was programmed right into a CNC machine and be able to be outputted and cut correctly, precisely. And the trade that had that technology was very low. So something that looked really costly, expensive, and complicated to some trades who were going to be doing it very manual based that drove their number higher. But the trade, the subcontractor, and the companies that had the technology, they could plug in that file and be able to output that device in much less dollars, saving time and schedule to the process, which to me, the purpose of drawing a project in BIM would be realized if we're able to utilize it more in the construction side of the equation. I think there'd be much less. I understand there's many risks, and our firm in general would have to, really tighten up how we would do our model for this to happen. But I also feel like there would be so much other information that we don't have labeled and listed on drawings that would get communicated as sharing the model. I think it would be, just unbelievably beneficial for people to get that additional information that we may not always note or label. I mean, I constantly get questions about, well, it looks like this, it looks like that. Did you really want us to do this because it isn't labeled? And it's like, of course that's what I want. It's the same thing. It's like, I just couldn't tag every single, iota on a project. It's just, railing for our project. We do a lot of sports projects, so certainly we have railings all over on the buildings. And if I could just have them look at the model for the railing instead of having trying to tag every single location, that'd save an immense amount of effort on our part. Not that I don't spend it modeling it correctly, but the tagging on the two-dimensional plans is a whole separate set of effort that the teams need to go through and do. And we may not get rid of all of it. I'm not sure how long it'll take to have somebody share an entire building with every discipline as a contract document, but I feel like starting with elements, starting with certain disciplines and certain components, that could start on projects, and to some degree it happens already kind of informally, but there should be a way to start to formalize that. And you asked how to make that method maybe better, and I know in our process, I don't know where I wrote it, but in our process or through the documents that'll be coming out, we did talk about, being clear about how you're going to use it so the design team knows when they're building it, how it's going to be used later on. You can't spring this on a design team at the 50% CD phase and say, oh, by the way, the contractor is expecting the model as the document, not your 2D drawings, and the model will govern. No, the whole design team and consultants have to know that from the start, because you approach the project very differently with that mindset. The other intent is that we would need our team, internal and external, to really be very clear on the rules of how we're going to set up the model. The AIA will be putting out a proposed BIM execution plan. Many firms kind of have their own versions. Rossetti, we kind of have something slightly different name, but on all of our projects, we develop this type of a document just to work within our own consultant team, so that we all understand how we're going to name things, how we're going to locate things, so that it becomes easy to share. But if we're going to go further, we need to understand what level of information, what is going to be modeled and what isn't going to be modeled. You know, the structural engineer may not model some of the miscellaneous edge angles around openings and edge of slabs. And that should be defined so that everybody knows not to look for that in the model. But the beams and the main items, columns, beams, roof elements, metal decks, you know, those things would be there, but some of that incidental might not be. So you want to create those, the BIM execution plan would include elements, that model element table that the AIA had previously had, with the LODs, which you would define either per phase, per object, so that everybody understands what level of information is being provided at various stages. But really, if you're doing a document, a contract document, what are we actually going to abide by at the time we turn it over to the contractor? What do we think is all there, and what do we think is potentially you still need to look at, you know, schedules or legends or other documents that is not fully a three-dimensional object. We say model, but any of the software out there, there are things that are modeled, and then there's other elements of information. There are legends, there are schedules that contain information as well. So those are some of the tools that I think we'll be seeing as some of those new documents from the AIA start to come out, which is trying to address this issue kind of head on, and giving some ground rules to try and start this idea, at least formally now.
Right, exactly. Thank you, Greg. That was a really very well articulated summary of the issue, I think. And if I could further summarize your summary, it would be, you know, models as contract documents is something that is probably coming and probably getting more common, and it's possible, but you have to be clear and be careful when you do it. And we've gotten some really good questions coming in, actually. And before I ask you a follow-up question that I had about BIM execution plans that you mentioned, I wanted to go through some of these questions and maybe brainstorm some responses with some of you. So one of the questions is to maybe to Greg and Pete from an architecture firm's perspective. Do you also design in 2D only, so something like AutoCAD, or are you exclusively working in BIM, or are there specific projects that maybe would lend itself better to one or the other? And it seems like some firms are wrestling with this question. Pete, I guess I'll go back to you. What's your firm's experience with this issue? Are you only one, only other? Is it situational, project based? What do you think?
Yeah, we're probably 99% using BIM. We do some projects with our interiors group where it might be a tenant fit out where there is no base model from which to work, but we get CAD drawings, and so we'll do that project in 2D CAD. But for the most part, we've evolved over the last 20 plus years so that it's all BIM all the time. Even Greg, to the point, unfortunately, where people can't sketch anymore. You ask somebody to sketch up an idea and they immediately fire up their computer.
Yeah, that would be true for us as well. We've been we don't maintain the AutoCAD systems anymore, the blocks, the title blocks, the updates over the years. We will still use AutoCAD as a tool for early design sketches and information potentially for layouts. But in terms of what we produce, construction documents and any project that would move ahead into construction, those are all in Revit. without question. I've only done, I think in the last 10 years, by force, because I inherited an entire set of CAD files. Another architect had kind of been out of a project, and we inherited something. It wasn't very big, but we had to make some modifications with the client, and we kind of utilized what they had to just kind of help move it ahead for the client. But in general, anything moving ahead is definitely in a BIM model through Revit.
And Virgil, from the owner's perspective, is that in line with what you're seeing? Are you receiving and working more in models, or are you still seeing a decent amount of that 2D AutoCAD type file framework?
Well, you know, Jimmy, my computer just had a connection loss. Can you still hear me?
Yeah, for sure.
All right. Well, basically, I really wanted to interject between these two gentlemen as a long-term owners, rep, owner, that kind of thing. There are two types of owners, first of all. And it's, you know, there are serial builders and then there are single builders. Generally, the serial builders have been driving this whole push to what Greg has said, what Peter's talking about. But the single builders will generally rely more on the architect to decide which way they want to go, for the most part. But you know, the whole deal is all about process and product and what's given to finally the owner, what the owner is left with. And so, you know, it really depends on which entity you're dealing with. For the most part, the serial builders will want to utilize, you know, BIM models. And what we've seen is that it's just driven that way because of so many different advantages for the owner, you know, in terms of taking the drama out of the project and that kind of thing. But that's kind of my first comment about that. There was another segment to the question. What was it you just said?
Are you seeing more in your practice now? Are you seeing more 2D drawings, or are you, the projects that you're involved with now, is it kind of moving more primarily toward models?
Models, period. We've primarily been dealing with serial builders for the most part, school districts, universities, you know, civic cities, you know, agencies, county agencies. And generally, these builders have facility, you know, elements in their organizations, and because of that, you know, most places it's going to be models. They're going to want to go that. They're pushing the technology, and if I may, you know, one of the things that when you think about it from an owner's perspective, and this is related to that question, what the owners, you know, the old traditional methods of the way we did things. The owner had a paper contract, they had paper drawings, paper O&M manuals, and then usually sometimes even a second set of drawings that were officialized as the as-built drawings. And so what's starting to happen because of technology, it's a great benefit to the owner to have all of this wrapped up into one electronic document that, number one, is easier to store, number two, and it's easier to recall, and it's easier even for the architects to have records, you know, of it as almost as a backup in terms of for future use for additions and renovations or resolutions of functional problems or design functions and things like that that go on. So
absolutely, that's a great point. Yeah, absolutely. We've gotten a couple more questions in, and they're really good. And I want to get to the rest of what we talked about, but I also think that these questions are important. So I'll go through them perhaps a little bit more quickly. But one of the questions is the introduction of modeling, particularly from the design side, might change the amount of negotiating leverage that the architecture firm has. And the question is, have you encountered a situation where you're part of a design team and the construction side of the project team demands or really desires a model, and the design side does not want to provide it. Have you been in that situation, and if so, how did you resolve it? And for this one, I'll go to Pete. And I can see you smiling and nodding your head, so I'm sure there's an anecdote to go along with this. But I guess what's your experience with situations like that?
Yeah, there's always the case where somebody needs a model, wants a model, expects a model, and there are times, especially working with contractors, where again the protocols aren't in place to be able to share a model, and the fee hasn't been structured such that we're able to provide the level of model support that contractor is looking for. And it's a tough situation, because contractors, especially during construction, the owner is going to listen to them because they control the purse strings, they control the schedule, and the owner needs the contractor to be able to perform. So if a contractor is saying, I need this from your architect, the owner is going to want to get that from the architect. So it's been an issue of pain and suffering in a lot of cases, trying to negotiate and become more collaborative, because I think we as a profession want to be more collaborative and work in the model and work digitally with the contractor to be able to facilitate a lot of the coordination and execution of the design that they're looking for. But it's also difficult to do that when the parties don't recognize the risks and aren't willing to sort of meet the design team halfway to be able to get those resources to the contractor. So happens all the time. It's probably 90% of my job.
Understood. And I would imagine that's a bigger problem if that request happens later on. And if you know a construction team is going to want a model up front, you can adjust your fee, you can adjust your scope, maybe your own individual project team who you staff on the project. If you know that's going to be the ask for 6, 12, 18 months from now, that that model is going over the other side, you work it differently. I've never worked in an architecture firm, but I understand that to be the case.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. We have clients very sophisticated, as Virgil called them, serial builders, who go into this knowing what they're going to need, what they're going to expect, and it's all very seamless, and we work it out. And there's really great collaboration throughout the process, whether it's with other consultants that maybe the owner hires, certainly with the contractors. We have on the opposite end of the spectrum, some owners who are maybe not aware of all of the issues and aren't willing to put into place either the protocols or even recognize the fee that's necessary to do that level of collaboration, and then drop it later on during construction and make demands. And that's when it gets to be difficult.
Absolutely. Greg, I have a question for you, sort of more on the practice side of modeling and coordination. So we have a couple questions about sort of coordinating and laying the ground rules for sharing. And one of the questions is, what's your approach, or maybe what are some best practices for maintaining and revising the model during the CA phase beyond the issued for construction, quote unquote, set? Do you revise and reissue models multiple times during the CA phase or through construction, or do you leave the model as is and work through the RFI? How do you do that? Maybe what are some best practices for that? And then from there, how might a BIM execution plan assist in that conversation?
All right, so yes, again, we haven't formally ever done a contract model. We have shared our models with contractors pretty often, but it's been the more informal version. Our process during construction, though, is we are updating our model generally through the replies to RFIs if we're finding major items on mostly RFIs, but maybe submittals. There could be some minor edits that we're doing. We would likely be reissuing 2D documents as either proposal requests or ASIs periodically during the course of construction so that everybody's looking at the right information. And we'd be sharing our model with our consultants on a regular basis all through construction. And again, if a contractor is asking at various times, we would likely share some portions of those, but it's always been a more informal kind of a progress. Here's what we've got. The change, if you go to contract, is that that contract document is you're going to need to be much more formalized about that process and much more rigid in that, or more process involved. And I would think you would be doing something similar. So every time you would be issuing some sort of ASI, you would be issuing a model that would go along with that potentially, so that it would be kind of locked in at each of those stages. And those models would contain everything, right? So it'd be a reprint of the whole building plus the change, and then the whole building plus whatever the next adjustment is to the project. So they would just be these constantly running updates that people would be replacing on their side, just like we do when we work with our design team. So in the design phases, you might be getting, depends on how you're sharing, you may be getting updates multiple times a day even, because you're sharing a file in the cloud. Anytime anybody saves, you're all seeing the latest and greatest every minute of the day. Likely when you hit construction, you're probably not at that type of sharing regardless, because things could be in process. Maybe there's a VE process. Maybe there's an owner change that affects multiple areas of the building. You wouldn't want the subcontractors seeing things that are in process, right? Where it would confuse them. You're still moving things around because of a field condition that you need to resolve. So you would wait until after you've issued something and kind of finished the thought, then you would be able to share it. I think the BIM execution plan and likely some other documents would have to outline this whole method of how you would be sharing updated models after construction, if it's a contract document. And certainly during the design phase, you would, even in that same BIM execution, you'd be outlining with your design team how you're going to be, whether it's daily, weekly, updates that the team is expected to be updating their information for coordination purposes.
And I would want to add to that, Greg, is that your serial builders are almost inventing that now. Ergo, as to why we at the AIA Contracts Document Group are really looking at posting out a BIM execution plan, giving contracts that include that are sort of BIM-centric kind of thing, because that's where it's going in terms of what's happening. And really all of this sort of rides on the back of many years ago, the AA put out its ideas or thoughts or guidelines for integrated project delivery. And so all of this pushes toward integrated project delivery, which is key to making all of this work at this point.
But I do think all of these documents would be usable for all, but I do think that they're probably less needed for the serial builders, the serial clients, and the larger firms and larger contractors. We probably are all doing some aspects of this already, but those one-offs or those smaller projects or the one-off project for a client, that this would be something that hopefully would be, there'd be at least some placeholders and some roadmaps for them to follow that wouldn't just be blank sheets to say, provide a BIM execution plan. There'd at least be something that they could utilize and mark up and use. The bigger offices, the bigger clients are going to write their own version of those documents, likely, is where I think this will end up.
And that's what's happening.
Absolutely. We've gotten some questions about, some specific questions about the AIA's new BIM documents. So I want to address that real quickly, and I'll actually take that one. So one of the questions is, for example, getting as granular as LOD 500, and how is LOD 500 addressed in the documents? What kind of guidance is there going to be around that? And recognizing that LOD 500 is somewhat different, obviously, than LOD 400, but potentially is even a different concept. And that is going to be addressed. So the LODs have been slightly modernized and updated, and those conversations occurred in conjunction with many industry stakeholders surrounding what the appropriate industry understanding is of the LODs and how to word that properly. And another question was, how do you lock the model from being used, and how is that addressed in the agreements? And what I'll say about that is, in preparing for this update of BIM documents, we reached out to every major modeling software vendor and had conversations with several of them and asked these types of questions. So we had a very good understanding of what they have currently offering and maybe what they have in developments, and then we could offer contract language that comports with that. And so I can't get into the substance of those conversations, but the new documents are structured in such a way that they are able to be used in a manner that's consistent with what's being offered now and what's going to be offered in the future from software vendors. And also, to create, if that's not available, to create workarounds, there's some defined terms that we've created that will allow you, so the question is about locking a model. If you're in a situation where you can't, the documents anticipate that and give you the ability to sort of have benchmarks and save different versions and reference different versions and that sort of thing. So with specific reference to the new BIM documents and the BIM exhibits, I would say, stay tuned for more of these webinars in the next couple of months, and we are going to very soon release those and have at least one, if not more, presentations going, essentially clause by clause through them and explaining what's different, how they're new, how they allow for things such as models as contract documents, LOD 500, locking the model, all of those types of things in these exhibits. So I would say stay tuned. And the best way to stay tuned is probably to give us a follow on LinkedIn. That's where a lot of the information is posted. And then you can be aware of when these updates come. So I just wanted to address that. One of the other questions that I think is really interesting that I wanted to ask, and I'll ask it, I guess, first to Greg and then perhaps to Virgil from the owner's perspective, is what do you do? How do you coordinate with maybe a sub or a supplier or a consultant who does not use BIM? They don't model, or maybe their scope of work might not require it, or maybe they don't have the technological sophistication to do it properly. Have you encountered that situation, Greg? And if so, how do you handle that?
Yeah, I mean, I think most, many, I'll say, most might be too many, but many of our subcontractors on projects are not doing anything in BIM. They are producing 2D information for us to look at, and we do it the way you've always done it. You're reviewing their submittal based on our design intent. We're looking at a model, maybe we're looking at our 2D drawings, but most of us, when we're in construction, we tend, at least in our office, we tend to be looking largely at the model when we're answering RFIs and looking at submittals and trying to coordinate to see, did they match what we're trying to do? Or if they made an adjustment, does it make sense because of some field condition that we can agree with? So it's most projects, that's what's happening. Our biggest dilemma has been, we share the model and then we never hear from the subs again. And I have just had a recent project where a multitude of multiple subcontractors had developed their own models in isolation. They drew a model, but they never had ours. The contractor did, but they never shared it. So each sub developed their own model independent of one another, and just caused a lot of problems. But it took us, they never submitted a model. We just saw the 2D drawings, and we would find out later somebody would go, well, I had a model. And I'm like, what do you mean you had a model? Why wasn't this shared? I mean, and, you know, we gave you our model. So like it became a really kind of chaos because the contracting team wasn't skilled with BIM. So they asked for a model and then they didn't know what to do with it. And then they didn't know to ask for it from their subs. And so they didn't understand how to deal with all of it. So that to me has been, in my past 10, 15 years, has been much more hit and miss who from a subcontractor is actually doing it. And the majority, we definitely see steel contractors across the country are heavily into models. We recently got some precast guys doing things in models. I had a food service vendor provide everything in 3D. We've done curtain walls and glass, metal panels have begun to start coming to us in 3D, but it's very new for a lot of those trades. So we're still at the beginning stage, I think, of really leveraging this model fully in the construction. Yes, there are large projects with lots of clash meetings of trades, main MEP guys, plumbing, fire suppression, but now starting to get into those architectural trades for, you know, glass, storefronts, cabinetry. You know, we're just starting to see some 3D from those subcontractors now. So those other ancillary architectural trades and even some of the other specialty, low voltage, food service, even signage and graphics. We've had one vendor that produced a couple of 3D documents that we were able to link in. So it's beginning to get to much more of those disciplines. But our challenge has not been that. It has been not having all of them kind of coordinated and organized from a contractor side has been the bigger challenges.
Sure. And Virgil, from the owner's perspective, is that something you're seeing pretty often or not? You know, from the owner's perspective, are you just saying, listen, I want a building, I don't care if you model or not, you know, that's on you, just give me my building by the date and for the price that I agreed to? Or are you seeing from your own experience and others, owners being more demanding of what they want from models and more involved in that model negotiation process about how detailed it's going to be, if it's going to be a digital twin for facilities management? Is there more involvement coming, or is it still just sort of like, I don't care what you do on your computer, just give me my building?
No, absolutely. It's been more involvement. You could translate involvement to mean even mandating and part of the contract in terms of requiring a BIM model, what features should be there, who should host the model during the design and construction phases. Primarily, as the sub-consultants or the subcontractors, owners are generally work through the primary consultants that they have contracting with. But what we're also seeing, though, is some of the larger contractors that are more, I guess, BIM-capable contractors. They're starting to use the model to assist their subs in terms of their estimating, their bidding, and some of their finalized detailing. So no, the owners are absolutely pushing this, particularly again with those serial builders. For the most part, those entities, and I'm sure my colleagues there will say that's really where it's coming from. And I might just say again, talk about minimizing risk and that kind of thing as the subject of this seminar. The owners are doing that because my favorite expression is every opportunity to take the risk, take the drama, out of the project that they're doing. And drama, it means less chaos. What less chaos means to where the owner can control the scheduling, the cost, the quality of what they get, and all those different items. And they're looking to this overall methodology of doing things with BIM as a centerpiece, as a tool to do that.
Absolutely. And I think you hit the nail on the head, Virgil. I think that's really important. We have time maybe for one more question, and we have a good one teed up here. And I think it really can serve to to hammer home the thesis of this discussion. And Pete, I'll come to you for our final question. And the question is, broadly speaking, is there a concern about architectural liability when you provide a model to a contractor? And the specific example is if a contractor uses the model in a way that's unanticipated. So like for estimating or quantity takeoffs. If there's something missing in that model, then that's potentially the architect's responsibility and therefore liability. So do you see it as the architect providing more effort, absorbing more risk, and not receiving any benefit in return, or not? And if not, why not? How do you manage that risk?
Well, so this is a perfect war story to address that. So, is there risk? Absolutely. There was a project, and this is when I first went out to our San Francisco office. We had a project under construction. Got a phone call one day from our client who was in India, telling us that we had a problem because the contractor had taken our model and was fabricating all of the stonework on the project based on our model, which was never intended. We never gave them that for fabrication. And the problem was that we didn't model the joints in the stonework. And so they cut all of the stone to the nominal dimensions. So everything was just slightly too large because they hadn't cut it to allow for the joints. And the contractor wanted a big change order, and the owner was looking to us to pay for that. So yes, there is risk. I think the issue really is the architect needs to understand why a contractor wants the model, how they're going to use it. I am all for collaboration. I love being on job sites. I love working with contractors. So it's really about communicating and understanding the purpose for having the model to make sure that the proper protocols are involved. They're not going to use it for any purpose other than what you're giving it to them for. And that risk has been fully mitigated amongst all the parties.
And I could not agree more, Pete. And I think that to give everyone a little teaser for what may be a part 3 to this BIM series is the new AIA BIM documents address that. And the intent is right at the onset of the project, everyone is on the same page with respect to how will the model be used and who will have access to it. And I think if you can answer both of those questions, then in theory, there should not be any increased liability to the architecture firm with model sharing, because it's the same liability that you get with the 2D model. If you understand all of the permitted uses for the model, you can build that into your QA/QC process and your modeling process and your fee. And everyone is on the same page at the front end to say, this is how we're going to model, this is how the model is going to be used, and everyone is on the same page. So you don't get that 11th hour request for, oh, by the way, we're going to use your model for quantity takeoffs. And you say, well, if I'd have known that 6 months ago, I would have modeled all the joints, but I didn't. And you avoid those miscommunications. So we have officially reached the top of the hour. Gentlemen, I cannot thank you enough for taking the time to be with us today. We had a really engaging audience as well. So thank you all for asking questions. And again, stay tuned for part 3 or future BIM webinars in the next couple of months, where we're going to go in depth into the new language of the documents. So Peter, Virgil, Greg, thanks so much for taking the time today, and I hope everyone has a great afternoon. Thanks very much.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.